Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. In today's episode, I'm joined by Rebe Huntman, and we're going to have a conversation about her new memoir, My Mother in Havana, a memoir of magic and miracle. Good morning, Rebe.
Good morning, Heather. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for being here. I am really excited to hear more about your book and to weave all things pilgrimage throughout our conversation. It's always nice to see a newly published memoir about pilgrimage, or at least that has a pilgrimage theme. And so I'm looking forward to others being able to read it as well. The memoir will be published on February 18th, which is the day this episode will air. I'd like to start our conversation with hearing about a couple of artifacts, or I should say 3 artifacts that you brought with you to share with us, to tell us a few stories about what these artifacts mean.
Thank you, Heather. What a beautiful way to start out today. I brought 3 artifacts because for me, pilgrimage is a process. I want to kind of challenge the notion that we go on a pilgrimage and we come back with like a single souvenir and that's it. For me, this pilgrimage has spanned decades. And so the first thing that I wanted to share is a note that my mother wrote to me when I was 19, and she was a couple months before she died, and we were together at a hospital in Mexico where she was receiving alternative treatment, and I had gone out for the evening, and when I came back, I found this on my pillow. So I was being kind of it wasn't my greatest moment as a daughter, I guess. Like I said, I went out and had fun, and my mother sat on the edge of her bed and wrote this note and placed it on my pillow. And what it says is, "Be my Valentine in August, because I love you always. Sweet dreams, Mother." And it's one of the few things that I have of my mother's, and it's in her handwriting. And it meant a lot to me at the time. Obviously, I kept it, but it means even more to me now. And one of the things, it was her death and my longing for her that set me on the pilgrimage to reconnect with whatever mother is. And this word always had always kind of tripped me up, because I love you always, because it's both true and a lie, because we are not always going to be here for our loved ones. And one of the things that really tripped me up after my mother died was this promise of being there always, which again, maybe lie is too harsh a word, but we kind of delude ourselves that our loved ones and those who hold us are going to be there for us always. And then when they're not, at least in my experience, it really threw me for a spin. And I spent the next 3 decades trying to understand that word always. And when I lost my mother when I was 19, when I was on the edge of turning 50, I found myself missing her in ways that were inexplicable. She'd been dead 30 years. I could barely remember the sound of her voice or the touch of her skin, and I missed her so much. And I missed her even more, or definitely in a different way than I had when I first lost her. And a lot of that longing had to do with the fact, I think, that I was about to turn the same age that she'd been when she died, that I'd expected my whole life that by the time you're 50, you really would feel grown and powerful as a woman moving through the world. And I didn't feel those things. I felt like a 19-year-old girl who still missed her mother. And that was very perplexing to me. And so my question was, if I really barely miss my mother, I mean, if I barely remember her, why? What is it that I'm missing? What is this thing called mother? And my culture, the culture I grew up in, didn't have an answer to that. I had never experienced a larger sense of what the mother is. My only reference point had been my biological mother. And so I set off to find the answer to that question. And that took me on a pilgrimage to Cuba. And Cuba is a place where the mother is celebrated. The spiritual mother is celebrated in very big ways. I knew that because in a previous iteration of my life, I'd been a Latin dancer and choreographer. I'd been to Cuba to collaborate with choreographers. I'd seen the dances that the ritual dances in Cuba that summon the gods and the mother spirits. And so I set off to Cuba. And it may seem like a very odd thing for a Midwestern girl to do, to go to Cuba to find her mother. And I find that that's one of the mysteries and the beauties of this particular pilgrimage, that on the face, it seemed far-fetched. It seemed like maybe it didn't make sense, and yet it absolutely did. I felt such a strong call to the island. And I think that what I found there was this large notion of the spiritual mother. I communed with, I attended an actual pilgrimage of 10,000s of Cubans that honor the patron saint of Cuba, Our Lady of Charity. I attended pilgrimages. I worked with Santeria priests and priestesses to understand another spiritual mother in Cuba, Oshun, who I can talk about later. And I met with a spiritist in the small town of El Cobre, because there's a beautiful braided religious experience in Cuba. It's not just Catholic, and it's not just Santeria, and it's not just Spiritism. It's a whole confluence of religious and spiritual traditions. And so the second artifact that I wanted to show is kind of the answer to that question always. And really, the answer to that is found in the pages of the book. It's going to be difficult to sum it up, in just a moment. But this is a gift from the spiritist who I met with. The book opens, My Mother in Havana opens with a scene where I am in the spiritist's workroom. I'd heard about him all the way from Ohio. He had a reputation as being the real deal, someone who could really help summon the spirits. And we spent hours in his workroom. And I won't talk about that experience in detail because the book does really good justice to it. But we spent hours, and I think he felt my need so greatly to have some sort of an X marks the spot, some sort of place that I could commune with my mother, that he made this for me. And it is made out of the dried out fruit of a calabash tree. It's got my mother's name on the front, and it has Our Lady of Charity, the patron saint of Cuba, on the top. And he gave it to me, and he said, I've never made anything like this for anybody, but I felt you really needed to have some sort of physical connection with your mother. And anytime you want to commune with her, you can take this. And so I keep it next to my writing chair. And it is one of the most precious things that I own, because it's that reminder that she's there always, right? It's that answer to that first question, that she is always there. And then the third artifact, and this one I'll speak about very quickly, is the book itself, because I feel that such a big part of the pilgrimage wasn't just what I experienced in Cuba, but then the 6 or 7 years that I spent really meditating on that experience and the gifts of that experience, and finding language to communicate it to others. And that is through My Mother in Havana, a memoir of magic and miracle. And the sunflower on the cover, your viewers will probably notice that I'm wearing sunflowers. This is the most ubiquitous symbol of Cuba's spiritual mothers, Our Lady of Charity and Oshun. And it's shown here in a gesture of offering. It's always an offering. And I feel that coming back from the pilgrimage and putting this book together was an offering to others, an invitation to others to also, follow their hearts and go on their own pilgrimage, whatever that means and looks like to them.
Thank you for sharing with us these 3 artifacts that were collected over a period of years, and then, well, the last one written about over a period of years. I'd like to focus directly on the memoir, and you've alluded to the reasons that you wrote it, and I'd like to delve a little bit more into that process for you, the 6 to 7 year process of putting the words into a structure, and why you decided to do that at this point in your life.
Yeah. So, this was not a book that I set out to write. I set out to heal myself. And as I said, when I was 49, I missed my mother more than ever. I set out on this pilgrimage to Cuba. I'd been a professional Latin dancer and choreographer. I was transitioning to a career as a writer. So I happened to be in graduate school for creative writing at the time that I made this pilgrimage. I thought that maybe I would write a few essays about the pilgrimage, and that might be included in a collection of essays that would deal with my search to heal from the grief of losing my mother. So I really didn't think that I was going to write an entire book. And I came home from Cuba I'd spent 30 days there. I spent 15 days in Havana and 15 days in the eastern part of Cuba, specifically in the town of El Cobre, where Our Lady's Sanctuary is. And the experiences were so rich. As I said earlier, I attended these pilgrimages. I'd never seen anything like it. 10,000 people that had come from all over the island, and some from Miami, and some crawling on their hands and knees, all to celebrate the mother. And I worked with the Santeria priests and priestesses to understand their spiritual view of the mother. I had this incredible experience with the spiritists in the town of El Cobre. And when I came back, there was so much. And I told my then thesis advisor, I said, I don't know how I'm going to write all these essays. And he looked at me and he said, Rebe, you're writing a book. And so I set out to do it. And it took a long time to braid all the pieces of it. But I'm really, really proud of the book that's come out of all of this. And I really hope, as I said, the image on the cover is an offering, and I really hope that it offers inspiration and healing to a lot of people who I hope will read it.
Did you intend to go on a pilgrimage, or was that something that you reflected back on your experience and identified as a pilgrimage once you returned?
I think that it was meant to be a pilgrimage. I think I very much used that language as I was setting forth to do it. The way that it came about was not quite so logical or linear. I was sitting with that newfound grief, and I decided, again, because I was doing a lot of writing then, that I would immerse myself in reading and writing and drawing the mother, because I was kind of grasping at straws, right? I knew I had this need and this longing, but I didn't know how to find the healing that I was looking for. So I was trying everything. A friend of mine suggested that I, do a portrait every day of the mother, biological mothers, spiritual mothers. So I found myself in the library looking at books about the spiritual mother. And one of them talked about the twin mothers spiritual mothers of Cuba, Our Lady of Charity and Oshun. And I'd been to Cuba, so I had some context. And it was literally like electricity ran through my body. I thought, this is where I need to go. And specifically what made me think that was reading about the pilgrimages to Our Lady of Charity's sanctuary. Because I'd read, that it was thousands and thousands of people, that they came on, many of them on hands and knees. And I thought, wow, in my experience, the celebration of the mother is kind of relegated to Mother's Day, these small private celebrations. I had never seen such a huge celebration for the mother. And so there was a sense that I needed to join them. And that became the anchor point. From there, I I developed kind of a 30-day pilgrimage that would end up there at Our Lady of Charity Sanctuary, but that would include these other elements. Because the other thing that interested me was not just this widespread devotion and celebration of the mother, but that Our Lady of Charity is thought by many Cubans considered syncretized with Oshun, who's an African deity of rivers and fertility. And again, from my background, that thinking, that capacious, thinking that a woman, a mother, could be both an African fertility deity and also this chaste Madonna. That was another question that really intrigued me. What is the mother? How can she be both? Because for my mother's generation, certainly, and also for mine, there were a lot of rules about what a woman could be and couldn't be. And it seemed to me as a young girl growing up, you had to choose, right? You could be sexy or you could be chaste, right? You could be flesh or you could be spirit. But this kind of larger sense that, wow, we are so vast and we really contain multitudes is why I incorporated in my pilgrimage not only the trip to Our Lady of Charity Sanctuary, but also a quest to really understand her twin counterpart, Oshun, and really talk to as many Cubans as I could and many people as possible to find, how do you reconcile that? How are these two one?
If it's okay, I'd like to go back and pick up a piece of a thread around what you described as a newfound grief or a reopening of grief. And I wanted to be clear that happened when you were turning around 50.
Yes.
This was not the original grief of age 19. You had lived a couple of decades of life without your mother physically, but there was something about turning 50 that reopened this major wound for you. And I'm curious if you have any insights into what prompted this grief to be tapped into at this point in your life.
Yeah, I'll try to answer that because, some of it was such an emotional experience, and I've given a lot of thought to why at that time. And as I said earlier, I think part of it was just I was struggling at that point with what does it look like to be a grown woman in the world, right? What does it look like to own my own agency and power and really feel like I'd expected to feel by that age, right? And I was really struggling to own that. And I think there was a sadness and a surprise by the fact that I didn't feel it. And I felt like I had perhaps lost the only role model I might have had who could have shown me the way. But there was a second sadness and a realization that I don't think my mother ever felt a sense of agency and power as a woman. And so part of my grief was this new grief, I think myself being a grown woman, reflecting on my mother as a grown woman and realizing just how difficult the way we had been raised, both of us probably, made it for us to claim that sense of power and agency. And I wanted to give my mother a do-over, in a sense. And part of that do-over was to find it myself, and heal us both through this pilgrimage.
The pilgrimage then is really about, it's your mother's pilgrimage in some way, in addition to your own pilgrimage. And it's also a pilgrimage about the complexities of being a woman, and there are many layers to the pilgrimage. And I'd like to focus for a moment specifically on the memory of your mother or the memories of your mother that you then carried into your your journey into Cuba.
Thank you. As I said, it's really interesting what happens when you lose a loved one. And one of the things that I really encourage people who've lost someone important to them to do is to just write down everything you remember, because it will get lost. Some things I don't remember. I cannot tell you the name of my mother's favorite perfume, even though I know she had one. She was funny. I remember she was funny, but I can't tell you one funny thing she said. She loved language. She loved words that were weird and complicated and funny, and they delighted her, but I can't tell you which ones they were. So those things have been lost. And but then other memories just stand out, like they flash really large. And I really leaned into those as I wrote the memoir. And one of them in particular is a memory of when I was 10 and my parents and I they had taken us to a fishing village in Mexico called Puerto Angel, or Port of Angels. And we almost drowned that day. We got caught in a riptide. My mother and I had been playing in ankle-deep water. My dad was photographing us, as he always did. He was documenting behind the camera. My mother and I were playing and laughing and splashing in, like I said, ankle-deep water, and then we got pulled out to sea. And it was too much for us. It was nothing that, we were gonna get sucked under that day. My mother held on to me, and this is what I remember and really point to in the book, is this memory that my mother held me in those waters. She did not let me go. Every time we got sucked under, she held me. And when we bobbed up to the top, she encouraged me to yell for help, even though there was no one on the beach. So obviously we didn't die that day, because I'm here talking about this memory. There happened to be a woman who came out for a walk on the beach. She called for help, and these professional divers who dived for coral for a living swam out to save us. And then the story, as all stories do, get even more complex, because then it became a story about men who swam out and saved these two women. But for me, it's always a story about my mother and how she did not let go and how she held on to me. And that for me becomes a real metaphor for this question of, are we held? Who and what holds us, right? And this longing to find the source of that sense of being held that is more enduring than just the biological mother or persons who hold us.
I'm curious about this concept of being held by the mother, and whether you or to what extent did you experience this during your pilgrimage, and what did that feel like?
It's a really beautiful question. My experience during the pilgrimage, and by pilgrimage, I'm talking about the whole 30 days in Cuba, was this opening up to even being able to entertain the idea that I was held, and by both the spiritual mother, but also by my own mother, that there was a sense of always. And one of the things that really vexed me in my own country was, as a 19-year-old, when I first lost my mother, the conventional wisdom that I received from college counselors and friends and well-meaning people that wanted the best for me, but they gave me what I think was some pretty terrible advice, which was, keep going, move on. That was then, your mother's gone, make something of yourself. And so I threw myself into making something of myself. I became such a tryhard. And I think that was part of, Heather, circling back to your question about what happened at 49 that really made me want to reconnect with my mother. Part of it was realizing that I had really shut the door on the thing I wanted most, which was a connection with my mother. And I did that in large in order to survive in a patriarchal world that's really focused on making something of yourself, individualism, getting ahead, all of those values. And so I had let go. We're asking about being held, but there was a sense in which I had let go myself of my mother. And in Cuba, everything that in my country I'd felt was looked upon as crazy, like talking to the dead or having a relationship with the dead. In Cuba, particularly amongst the Afro-Cuban religions and the folk Catholic traditions, the idea is, of course, you talk to the deceased. They're there, right? They are holding us. They are there for us. That's as simple as lighting a candle, putting out a photograph, talking with them. You can sleep before, build an ancestral altar and sleep before it if you have anything troubling you, and the ancestors will answer. They're there. They're waiting for us to talk. They're waiting to hold us and support us and guide us. So, and then on top of that, that you'd have these spiritual mothers, Our Lady of Charity and Oshun, and whatever this great mother is. We all have different names for her. But that something is holding us, that we're not alone, that we belong to a longer and deeper story through the ancestors and through the spirits. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did, and it leads into another question, because that's how my brain works. I'm curious about the specific Santeria rituals that you encountered during the pilgrimage, and I don't know much about Santeria, so I'm hoping that you can describe what these rituals are and what they meant for you and how you experience this creation of meaning while also being immersed inside the ritual itself.
Yeah. So I think that for most North Americans, we either don't know much about Santeria, or the images or ideas that we've encountered through very sensationalized movies and things like that. So what Santeria is the byproduct of probably one of the most violent chapters in American history, which is the Atlantic slave trade that brought Africans to Cuba, to many parts of America. But I'm talking about Cuba in the case of Santeria. And the Yoruba of West Africa were brought in large numbers to Havana and to the western part of the island to work the plantations there. And the Spanish basically said when they arrived, all right, here are your new gods. Here's Jesus. Here's Mary. Here are all the saints. And you need to worship them. And the Yoruba were like, okay, but that one looks a lot like, your Mary looks a lot like our Oshun and our Yemaya and so forth. And so they were able to continue worshiping their gods and being devoted to their gods clandestinely by publicly embracing the Catholic saints, but in their hearts, really syncretizing them with their own gods. And so the result of that is that centuries later, there's still this braided religion that is syncretized between the Catholic gods and saints and the Yoruba pantheon. And it's really remarkable. I think there's a misconception that Santeria is a polytheistic religion. It is a monotheistic one, where there is one God, Olodumare, who is too vast to comprehend. And so we have these intermediary gods, like Oshun, the deity of rivers and love, who that's her specialty, right? And then the other thing about Santeria is this idea that we each have a guardian, Orisha. Orisha is their name for gods. And that we're made in their image and that it's a blueprint we can follow. And so there are many, many different possibilities of who your guardian Orisha would be. I felt like mine was Oshun because she had been calling me. She had been calling me through the dances that I had learned when I was in Cuba as a dancer. She had been calling to me through the pages of this book. She'd been calling to me through her twin counterpart, Our Lady of Charity. And so I felt in my bones that she was my guardian Orisha. But it wasn't until I had immersed myself in some of the initiations that was validated by one of the Santeria priests that indeed she is. So there's another sense of being held, Heather, in that we're held in this image of our guardian Orisha who's there to guide us through life. Specific initiations, I am not an expert and I don't pretend to be in Santeria or in initiations, but I did have the good fortune of meeting Santeria priests and working with them and entering into some of the initial initiations into Santeria. And so maybe you can ask me if there's something specific that you want me to talk about those, because I kind of gave a lead up to it, but I can also speak a little bit about the initiations.
I'd like to hear about the initiation rituals, and then I am curious about and maybe we can talk about this later, but I am curious about how the spiritist that you met with fits into this larger picture and whether that is a Santeria practice that you engaged in, or this is another part of your own personal pilgrimage.
Thank you. So two parts. First of all, I'll answer the question about the spiritist. Spiritism is another religious tradition, spiritual tradition in Cuba that is actually born out of the French. I think it's Allan Kardec is the name of the French spiritist whose ideas took root in Latin America and took on Latin American and African and Spanish and Catholic overtones. So it's a mix of. We call it in the U.S. the movement was called spiritualism, which is a little bit different, but it's basically a belief in the power and the ability to commune with the other side. And so I met with a spiritist named Madeline in El Cobre, and he does so. He's able to communicate with the other side through a spirit he calls El Cimarron, who is the spirit of an escaped slave who talks with Madeline, talks through him, and then allows him to connect with people from the other side. So that's spiritism. And then Santeria, what they share, and I think what all of the components of my pilgrimage shares, is this belief that the veil between this world and the other is very porous, and that we can commune with that other side. And so with Santeria, there's a progression of instructions and initiations that allow us to deepen our connection with the Orishas that guide us and look out for us. And so I will touch briefly on them here, but if this is of interest to your viewers and listeners, I go into great detail in the book about my experiences. But the first one is the initiation, in which the initiate receives the guerreros, the warriors. And these are the spiritual warriors that open the doors, positive experiences, hopefully, and who protect you and guide you. These are your four principal guides through into the spirit world. And again, I go into in great detail in the book, and it really deserves more than I'll be able to speak to about here. But before you can even speak with the spirits or the gods, the Orishas, comes the the request from the ancestors to grant you access, to approve that. So there's always this communing with the ancestors and then into the spirit world. And there's one of the important components of Santeria is that we have these orishas, we have these guides to show us how to live a good life, how to earn our place as future ancestors. And they're constantly giving us guidance and instructions. And in order to solicit that, in order to thank for that guidance, we offer offerings. And those offerings can vary. They can be flowers and candies, or they can be animal sacrifices as well. And with the idea being that the blood of the animal carries the life force, and is that we're feeding the orishas through those sacrifices. And so that was something, and I talk about it in the book, that was so outside my experience. Full disclosure, I was a vegetarian for much of my life. And so it was one of those things where I stood at the threshold of experiences where they were both unfamiliar to me, and yet very compelling. And I talk about that as well, what it was like to really enter a world that was so different from my own experience.
How do you think this period of discomfort or disorientation from your routine life, how did it act as a companion to you as you went through your own reopened grief process?
Yeah. Well, Heather, it's a beautiful question. I say in the book, in My Mother in Havana, I prayed for change on this trip. I wanted change. I needed change. And that change was terrifying, right? I had just started a relationship, an important relationship, my significant other. And I thought, wow, I want to come back changed, but not so changed that he won't still love me, right? Or not so changed that I won't be able to keep my job, or that my friends will all point and say, wow, she came back crazy, right? So I wanted the change, and I feared it in equal parts. And I think we can't change without going into new places, right? That broader, that totally different perspective, I needed that in order to change myself, in order to accept. When I came back with a vow to myself that I wanted to keep all of the things I had learned there, that more open, expansive view of what's possible. And that to me, it was more important to hold on to that and maybe risk losing some friendships, which, by the way, I didn't. But I was willing to sacrifice it all, because I think that was one of the biggest gifts of this pilgrimage, was realizing that what I had turned my back on when I was 19, right, was this ability to open, right, and really open spiritually, and talk to my mother and invite her back in. So, when I came back, I was like, I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm just so grateful for all of the change and all of the vastly different experience, because, to be honest, the one I grew up with was not working for me. And I love living in a world, we talked about, I began our talk with 3 artifacts. And the reason why is I wanted to talk about this sense of process, and the pilgrimage is not over. I'm still changed and changing because of those experiences.
As I'm listening to you talk about your mother going away, your mother passing away, and then your own search to find her, I'm thinking about some of the work of attachment theorists in psychology who did a number of experiments where children were observed in rooms and their mothers left the rooms or their caregivers left the rooms. And what these researchers were looking at is how does a child respond once the mother returns? Do they turn away from the mother? Do they cry? Do they run and reunite with the mother? And then their conclusions about all of this had to do with how securely attached a child was to the mother and the mother to the child. And so I'm struck by this in thinking about at 19, your mother goes to another room. Really, I mean, that kind of, there's spiritually, she goes to another dimension. She's in another room. And this process that happens for you impacts your attachment. And so you later go searching for your mother in the other room. But it also strikes me that you are, the attachment to yourself changes also, that it becomes stuck at 19. So what you're also searching for here is not only the primary caregiver, not only the mother, you're also in a search for yourself or even who you were at age 19, because that attachment has also been severed by this trauma of losing your mom at a relatively young age.
I think that's fascinating. I love pulling that in, and it made me think of two things. It made me think, one, and I think it's worth mentioning, I had a really good relationship with my mother. My mother wasn't perfect. I talk about it in the book. I went through some, period of real rebellion against her. But I recognize that, a lot of my friends didn't have that experience with their mother. We all have different relationships and different attachments and experiences of the mother. And I think that that's one of the beauties for me of looking at the spiritual mother, because I think we put a lot on our own biological mothers in terms of expectations and needs. And those can never be met, even when we have, a terrific relationship with our mother. It's too much to expect from any human being. And so I think that this idea of the spiritual, of giving ourselves a break as women and as mothers, and a little break on our mothers too, and say there's a larger, maternal energy that holds us all. But the second thing I wanted to say about what you said is just reminded me of a story that I tell in the book, and that's really foundational to Our Lady of Charity in Cuba. And that's her foundational story. She's an icon. She's, picture, when you think of Our Lady of Charity, she's both a physical object about, a 1.5 feet tall that was reportedly found floating in the waters in this early 1600s by these three miners who were at sea. But there's a second part of that foundational legend that tells of a young enslaved girl named Apollonia. And the story goes that she was looking for her biological mother, and she climbs a hill to find her biological mother, because that's where, her mother worked in the mines, and that's where she could normally be found. And the version of the story that I really, really like was told to me by the priest who watches over her icon in El Cobre, Cuba, in her sanctuary. And he told me when Apollonia goes up the hill, she's looking for the mother who has died. She's looking for a deceased mother, and she's bereft. And even though it doesn't make sense, she's trekking up this hill because in the hopes that she'll find her mother still there where she should be. And she goes, and her mother isn't there. And she's bereft, and she pounds the earth with her fists, and she's just is absolutely beside herself with grief. And then at that point, Our Lady of Charity, in some guise, appears to her and says, "I'm your spiritual mother," right? And Apollonia runs down that hill. She'd run up it filled with grief and with the tears of grief. And then runs down with the joy of being reunited with her spiritual mother, Our Lady of Charity. And she comes down to tell the whole town, our mother is here.
So there are many parallels then with this story of Apollonia and the story of Rebe Huntman.
Yes.
It's like a parallel journey that's happening. I want to dig into a little bit about your encounters with different elements of spirituality that were different than the spirituality of your childhood or of your awareness up to this point. And I'm curious if you can expand a bit on how your spiritual practices or your sense of spirituality has changed as a result of this pilgrimage or series of pilgrimages.
Yeah. So I would say that my practices very much involve ancestral worship, and this is since coming back, right? Because I think foundational to the spiritual practices that I encountered in Cuba is this idea of ancestral worship. It's the idea the ancestors are our gateway to the spirit world, that they're there with us always. And so for me, something I've carried from that experience and continue to practice very diligently is the keeping of the ancestors here in the home in a very visible way, and remembering to communicate with them, to light a candle, to offer drink and food, and sometimes have dinner together, and to talk not only with my mother but with as all of my father, my grandparents. So that is something that has really strengthened and been a real source of healing for me, is maintaining that open door, and being able to share that with others and encourage others who are grieving to do that.
25 years ago, what would you have thought about this practice?
I think that my first impulse, I almost want to cry. I really wish that I'd encountered it 25. I think it would have saved my life a lot sooner. I really believe in the life-giving messages and the importance of these traditions, and they're not limited to Cuba. I feel when I talk about my upbringing, I have a friend in Mexico who said that people living in the United States were a bunch of weeds with no roots. Right, our roots have been cut. But we all belong to a tradition. Our heritage, before those roots were cut, had some of these very similar spiritual beliefs, right? In keeping the dead close, in honoring the mother, in, having an earth centered, practice. So I think that these are ideas that are available and important to all of us, and that we all can reach back to our past. And if we talk to our grandmothers and our great grandmothers, they would have been like, yeah, of course we do these things. So I wish, and the short answer to your question was, boy, I wish I'd had access to these beliefs 25 years ago.
I can certainly relate at some level to the grounding practice and importance of connecting to one's ancestors. I think many of us do this through genealogical research, where the information that we find in historical documents or in photos or in letters in some ways is a type of connection to our ancestors that seems more important for many people than simply like a historical research quest. There's something that is bigger, and I can certainly relate to that. I have been drawn to this type of research since I was an adolescent, and I can't quite explain it, but the way that you're describing this practice of of connecting to the ancestors, it's not a far jump for me to see why and how this could be really important.
Yeah. And I love that you said that, Heather, because I was also one of those kids. I've always been the family archivist, um, or the person in the family that's been most interested in understanding the stories of the people who came before us. And I went on a big deep dive into ancestry.com. And I feel there's a reaching in that, right? I think that's what you're talking about. We're reaching for something deeper as we're doing that.
Definitely. I think just a sense of being grounded in a historical reality and actual people that were living on this planet before we came along. I think it's important to feel connected to that, for at least for me and for others. Some people have no interest in it, and that's also curious to me. I'm curious why some people are drawn to this and other people are not.
I think there's some real healing here, Heather, that I feel like you're getting at. There's a sense of grounding that some of us are reaching for, some of us may not be, but or not know what we're reaching for, but there's a sense that our stories are deeper and richer than just this particular blip of a lifetime. And one of the things that I love about spiritual practices like Santeria or Spiritism or any of these practices is this sense of earning your place as an ancestor. Like if we really are ancestors, or if we have ancestors that are guiding and protecting us, and if we eventually, when we pass, are going to become an ancestor, that's a real responsibility. And there's a sense in the Afro-Cuban traditions of having to earn your place as an ancestor. Like it's a real honor and a privilege to look out for future generations. And we don't really have that sense of that in today's world, which seems more to revolve around looking out for number one, right? Today is all we have. And I think that we would be really suited as individuals and as a society to embrace this sense of our important role in the long story of our lives.
I totally agree with that. I think we live differently when we have a sense of awareness of our own mortality. We're here for such a short period of time, but having an understanding of the struggles and the wishes and desires and dreams of those who came before us. And then we take our place here momentarily, but thinking about those who will come after us, I think we live a more meaningful life because we're connected. There's a sense of connection rather than we kind of just emerged suddenly in one year and then we die. This idea that we are more than a mark on a tombstone, that we're connected in a way that has a much longer history and that has a much longer legacy than we often realize.
Yes, I love that, Heather. And I love also, if you think about tracing our lineage, that act, whether it's on ancestry.com or a more spiritual way or whatever, if we trace that lineage back far enough, we find that those of us that we consider strangers or other or different from us, that we all trace our lineage back and back to common ancestors, that we are indeed brothers and sisters and cousins. And that makes living very different when we, how do we treat one another when we realize that we really are family?
The final question that I have for you is, I'll return to the beginning question, which had to do with your narrative of losing your mother at age 19, which was traumatic. In any assessment of the situation, we can label that as a traumatic event. And I'm curious how the pilgrimage, um, how has the pilgrimage led to intergenerational healing?
I think again about the story I told about Apollonia, who was so bereft, and she climbed that hill looking for her mother and came back with the gift of something even larger, right? This sense um of embracing and being held by a spiritual mother. And I really carried a trauma narrative with me for so long. When I lost my mother at 19, I was a sophomore in college. None of my friends, personal friends, had lost a mother. Um, and so there was this sense of why me, right? Everybody else gets to keep their mothers, and I lost mine. And how could this happen to me and poor me? And it was really the defining moment of my life for so long, and got in the way of relationships, because there was this sense of needing to be mothered, wanting everybody I met to be my mother. I mean, I laugh about that, but it was kind of true. It's like, um, the need was so great, and I feel that the need has been met, right? Like we are all mothered in ways that are so large. And this is one of the things I really hope that people who read My Mother in Havana, it's a gift I hope that people will get this sense of where, and not everybody is going to embrace the spiritual, but literally we're all mothers, right? We all mother in ways large and small. And where can we tap into that? And how can we embrace and give to this sense of holding ourselves and holding others, which is something I feel like we really, really need right now.
I want to thank you for being a guest on Psychology of Pilgrimage. My Mother in Havana is out February 18th. It is a pilgrimage of grief, transformation, identity, and ultimately healing.
Thank you so much, Heather.